This LOS is describe the phenomenon of diminishing marginal returns. We're starting this reading with a bit of a reminder. It says recall from the prerequisite reading. So there's some reading that is required before this reading. And it's talking about the supply curve, okay? So just very quickly, and you should know this, is that we have the price here on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have quantity. So as we've seen before, the demand curve is downward sloping. As we decrease price, we're going to increase the quantity demanded. But with regards to the supply curve, if we increase price, we're going to increase the quantity supplied. And at some point, there's an equilibrium price, and there's an equilibrium quantity, okay, for that good. So just getting back to the equation with regards to the supply curve, the quantity supplied equals the intercept plus the sensitivity to its own price times the price of X minus the wage sensitivity times W, okay? So the supply curve depicts the quantity producers are willing to supply at each price or lowest price accepted for each quantity. And the law of supply, it's a positive relationship between price and quantity. So again, the quantity supplied of X is a function between the price of the good and the wages, that is the wage rate that is paid to labor, because to increase supply is going to take more work and more labor, okay? So you can see the quantity supplied of X, intercept, plus the sensitivity to its own price times the price of X, minus the wage sensitivity times W. So looking now at the supply analysis and looking at the firm, to fully comprehend the supply side of a consumer goods market, an analyst must understand the firm's costs. The firm's marginal cost is the foundation of the firm's ability and willingness to offer a given quantity for sale, and its costs depend on both the productivity of its input and their prices. Okay, here we're going to go through some terms and then some of the calculations. And again, we're going to study some of this in accounting, but nevertheless, a lot of this is just really kind of common sense, economics 101 or accounting 101. So the first one, in terms of profit, economic profit is the total revenue minus the total economic cost, okay? And so in the economics, they're going to use some shorthands. So you can see that's TR minus TC. Total revenue minus total cost, but it's the economic cost. So total revenue, we should know how we calculate total revenue. It's the price times the quantity, or the sum of the individual units sold times their respective prices. So of course, how do we get the total revenue? It's the quantity times the price. The average revenue would then be the total revenue divided by quantity. And the marginal revenue would be the change in total revenue divided by the change in the quantity. So that's when we're getting more into the economics now, when we start talking about average revenues, marginal revenues, and then later on some marginal costs that we'll see, okay? So marginal revenue is the change in revenue, total revenue divided by the change in quantity. Change in total revenue divided by change in quantity. So getting down now to the cost side, the total fixed cost is the sum of all fixed expenses, here defined to include all opportunity costs, because we're talking about economics. So we're not talking about necessarily accounting costs. We're talking about total fixed costs, all fixed expenses, including opportunity costs. We don't see opportunity costs on the income statement. So total variable costs is the sum of all variable expenses, or per unit variable cost times the quantity. Well, that is accounting 101. Total cost is the total fixed cost plus the total variable cost. Our average fixed cost then is the total cost divided by the total quantity. That's fine. Average variable cost is the total variable cost divided by quantity. Also quite easy. And average total cost is the total cost divided by quantity. Fine. And the marginal cost, which is an important one, is the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. Well, that last slide was a nice little summary, but if you're just learning some economics for the first time, this blows it out a little bit bigger font and a bit more detail. So the total revenue, again, is the total receipts from the sales of goods or service. Total revenue equals price times quantity. We should know that. Average revenue is the mathematical average of revenue per unit sold. So that's just our total revenue divided by our quantity. And marginal revenue is the revenue on the next unit sold. So this is important when we get into the economics, when we're looking at marginal revenues and marginal cost, It's the revenue on the next unit sold. So it's the change in total revenue divided by the change in the quantity. And in, that change in quantity would be 1. And you'd look at, what's the change in the total revenue? Well, the change was 5 in the total revenue, and the change in the quantity was 1. So we know our marginal revenue would be 5 in that case. Again, just quickly reviewing that summary of the table. So the total cost is the sum of all costs of producing goods or services. The total fixed cost is the sum of all costs that do not change with the level of production. And of course, we're going to learn more about fixed costs and variable costs in the accounting section later. But a quasi-fixed cost is a cost that is fixed for a specific range of production, but that will change at different levels of production. Okay? Total variable cost is the sum of all costs that change with the level of production. So variable costs change with the level of production. That would be something like labels. Labels are a variable cost. The more bottles we produce, the more labels we need to put on. So labels are a variable cost, as are the bottles. The average fixed cost is the total fixed cost divided by the quantity produced. The average variable cost is the total variable cost divided by the quantity produced. The average total cost is the total cost divided by the quantity produced. And the marginal cost, again, is the change in total cost for one more unit produced. So now we're getting into some important points here with regards to supply analysis in the firm. Profit is maximized when the difference between total revenue and total cost is maximized, which is also the point at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So as I said before, we need to start to get familiar with some of these economic terms for example, marginal revenue and marginal cost. And so now, why is that important? Because profit is maximized at the point at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So determining profit maximizing output requires 1, forecasting the revenues and costs in order to estimate the production levels at which the difference is maximized. 2, computing the change in total revenue per unit and the change in total cost per unit and produce to the point at which they are equal. And finally, 3, comparing the estimated cost per unit of input with the contribution margin per unit. Okay, we haven't seen contribution margin per unit yet here in the economics. Flash forward to the accounting, and sales minus variable cost gives you your contribution margin. And we like to put things in a per unit basis, so we'd have our sales dollar per unit or euros minus our variable cost per unit gives us our contribution margin per unit. Later on, we'll see in the accounting the break even. The operating break even is the fixed cost divided by the contribution margin per unit. Anyhow, don't worry about that for now, but you should be familiar with the contribution margin per unit is the point that I'm trying to make. Okay, now we're going to look at some revenue minus cost relationships and then some actions by the firm. So when total revenue equals the total cost and marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, the firm is operating at lower break-even point. Increase the quantity to enter profit territory. When total revenue is greater or equal than total cost and marginal revenue equals marginal cost, well, we know the firm is at the maximum profit level, no change in Q. Just remember that. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost, that's we're at our maximum profit. If total revenue is less than total cost, well, you can figure that out. And total revenue is greater or equal than the total variable cost, you find the level of quantity that minimizes the loss in the short run, work towards finding a profitable quantity in the long run, exit the market if losses continue in the long run, okay? And if total revenue is lower than total variable cost, not covering the total variable costs in full, shut down in the short run, exit the market in the long run. And finally, if total revenue equals total cost, but the marginal revenue is less than the marginal cost, the firm is operating at the upper break-even point, decrease the quantity to enter profitable territory. Now we're going to start to look at labor and labor productivity. So productivity is the average output per unit of input. Labor productivity is used as a measure of productivity because it is easily identified and measured. So a unit of input for labor equals L. Increasing productivity increases profitability. In the case of labor, increased rewards to workers may further increase productivity. So would training and education, for example. Measures. Total product or output is the sum of production in number of units produced, also represented as Q. Average product is the total product divided by the number of units of input. And marginal product is the productivity of the next unit produced, or the change in total product if one more unit of input is added. Now we're moving on to marginal returns and productivity. The marginal product is the change in the total product from a 1 unit change in the input. We saw that on the previous slide. And increasing marginal returns exist when the marginal product of an input increases when using more of the input. Diminishing marginal returns exist when the marginal product of an input decreases when using more of the input. The law of diminishing returns is the law that adding another unit of input will result in less marginal product than the previous unit of input. Anyhow, that's a lot of accounting speak. When we talk about the law of diminishing returns, let's look at studying for the CFA, for example. When you're first studying and you're climbing that learning curve, for every hour that you're studying, you're learning more. Okay, so the output is great, but after you've studied, let's say you get to hour 350. For each hour that you study, you're not really learning all that much more. You're not making more progress along the learning curve. You're moving sideways along the learning curve. And so you've had a diminishing return on that hour of studying. So we talk about the law of diminishing returns quite a bit. Just in essence, it's that you're not getting the same output for the same unit of input, okay? So the marginal revenue product is a change in total revenue from a 1 unit change in the input. Okay, this is just a little graphic that shows you some of the concept in terms of labor as an input, total product, which is an output, marginal product, and your average product, okay? So from labor here, we're starting with no labor, so there's no product, there's no production. But we increase the labor from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 units, and you can see the total product is going to increase from 10 to 19 to 27 to 34 to 40. So the marginal product is, you can see, 10 minus 0, because we have 10 units were added for 1 unit of labor, and the previous level was 0. So 10 minus 0 equals 10. As we get up to 2 units of labor, our product is 19. So we can see the marginal product is the 19 minus the 10 equals 9. Similarly, as we move up to 3 units of labor, we get to 27 units. So we do 27 minus 9. You can see our marginal product is going down, okay? So over here on the average product, that's easy. You're just looking at your total product divided by your labor. So 10 divided by 1 equals 10, 19 divided by 2, 9.5, 27 divided by 3 equals 9, 34 divided by 4, 8.5, and finally 40 divided by 5 equals 8, okay? So a nice little graphic with regards to labor, total product, marginal product, and average product. Okay, this is another important rule that you need to memorize. If there's a single input, the profit maximizing level of output is the point at which the marginal revenue per product equals the price of the input, okay? If there is more than one input, the profit maximizing level of inputs is the point at which the marginal products of the inputs relative to their respective prices are the same, okay? So that's the marginal product of 1 divided by the price of 1 equals the marginal product of 2 divided by the price of 2, okay? So it's the ratio is the same. The optimal level of each input is the point at which the ratio of the marginal product to its own price is equal to 1. We're going to finish this LOS with a little example. Suppose that the cost per unit of input 1 is 16 euros and the cost per unit of input 2 is 10 euros. If the cost of the product is 2 euros 50, or which is the selling price, and the total products are as below, what are the optimal levels of input 1 and input 2? Okay, we solve that is that we know that to get our optimal levels, we want to get the marginal product of 1 divided by the price of the input of input 1 equals the marginal product of 2 divided by the price of the input 2. So here we're looking at the marginal product. We're going to divide that by the price of the input 1, and here we're going to look at the marginal product of input 2 divided by the price of, and where they're equal, or closest to being equal, is at 4 units for input 1 and 3 units of input 2, okay? So we can see the optimal levels are 34 units here, total product, and 40 here, okay? So the calculation, the profit then would be the €2.50 times 34 plus the 40, minus the 4 units times the €16 cost, minus the 3 units times the €10 cost. That gives us 185 minus 64 minus 30, and the optimal level is going to give us €91 of profit. And that's the last slide for this LOS. Thank you.